Welcome to the second video of this series. In this video we will be covering how to film your stop motion animation. We'll be talking about lighting, we'll be talking what kind of gear to use, and how to steady your shots. So first is lighting. We'll talk quickly about lighting. So in short, you want light that's not changing. You want a nice consistent light. This usually means that you shouldn't be using daylight, because what will happen with daylight is daylight changes, so as you are animating your piece, you'll be seeing lots of flickering, your light's getting brighter, darker, brighter, darker, brighter, darker because of the light changing. So ideally you would be using all artificial lights if you can. So I'll quickly mention the 3-point lighting setup if you haven't heard of it yet. MediaCollege.com has a really good 3-pointing lighting simulator which shows you what 3-point lighting looks like. The idea of 3-point lighting is you want 3 light sources in your scene. 3-point lighting is like a default standard lighting setup. You don't have to follow every single light here, but it's just a general guide for lighting in a standard scene. So the first light is called a key light or a main light. When you turn this on, this is what you get. It's meant to light up your subject. This is the main light that if you ask somebody where is the light coming from, they will say it's coming from this direction. You'll notice without any other lights in the scene, what happens is you get some dark shadows over here near the nose. Over here you can't see this other ear, so it's a little bit too dark on this side. So what you use is another light called a fill light. If I turn this on, you'll see what happens is it kind of fills in all the shadows, so now the image is a little bit more flat and less harsh to look at. And we've gotten rid of those really, really harsh shadows on the nose and the ears. The fill light is usually a little bit softer than the key light, and that's why it's displayed over here as like half strength. And if you ask somebody where the light's coming from in this photo, they'd still say it's coming from this direction, even though there's 2 lights, because this light isn't as strong, it's just filling in the gaps. Now there's also a backlight, or this is also known as a rim light. If you turn this on, what this does, it makes the subject just pop out of the background. Without it, the subject just kind of blends into the background. You turn this on and they just kind of pop right out. Pop, pop, like that. And that's the basic 3-point lighting setup. Now, it's 3 sources of light. It doesn't necessarily have to be 3 different lights. So if you had a light here and then like something reflective here, that might take the light that's coming from the key light and bounce it back. So you could technically do a 3-point lighting setup with only 1 light. And don't forget that something like a sun, the sun is a big source of light, so usually the sun is used as a key light or a backlight. And a lot of times it's used as a fill actually as well, using a reflector. And that's a basic 3-point lighting setup. Now you might not be able to create a 3-point lighting setup at home, but it's good to know the basic theory about it. Next thing to be aware of when you're doing some lighting is soft light and hard light. If you have a harsh light, you will be having very harsh shadows, and this can be appealing for a very moody piece. But a lot of the times you want to soften your light. To soften your light, you can use what's called a diffuser. If you don't have a diffuser, you can use a bed sheet or some baking paper or something like that to soften the light. In a studio setup, you might have something called a softbox, which is made specifically to soften lights and give you a more appealing look. Okay, and now moving on to gear that you might need. Now, ideally, if you're doing stop motion, you might need something like armatures, things that will hold your characters or your objects up. This little toy thing would probably topple over if it didn't have this thing holding him up. And once you've done your stop motion, you can remove this piece in Photoshop. Now I'm assuming most of you don't have access to this kind of gear, so let's move on. Now you don't need fancy gear to do this kind of stuff. You could do it with cheap gear as well. So you can just use some modeling clay, or you can even use blue tack. You could use toothpicks and things to just hold up objects, or just even sticks to just hold up objects or things, or string. Or you could just use any objects you have lying around, like animate some coins or something. You might use a printer. You might have a printer lying around with lots of paper. You can print out lots of little different drawings and move them one by one. And you can even use something like green paper to do some green screening to remove the background from your images as well. There's professional camera gear for stop motion. There's really big equipment like this, which is motion controlled cameras. These cameras can be programmed to move any way you like and for as many times as you like. This is how you can create camera movement in stop motion. You can program it to move only when you tell it to move and how little to move as well. If you don't have access to something like this, you probably want to have a stationary camera. You can move the camera manually yourself, but it's very hard to control yourself. So if you don't have one of these machines, it's probably best if you were just to stabilize your camera. This is the most common stop motion gear, just having a normal DSLR camera with a tripod, and over here this is a remote switch, also called a shutter release. The reason you might need a shutter release is so that you can take photos without having to press the button on the camera, which would shake the camera a little bit. You want to try to have as little camera shake as possible. But of course, if you don't even have a tripod, you probably do have a camera phone. You can use your camera phone with some free DIY tripod tricks like this, using a paper towel roll and just cutting in a little hole and sticking your camera in. Or you can use this. This was made with like wires or something, or a little box here. Just Google DIY tripods and you'll find a whole bunch of different examples of how you could make your phone stand. Just look around your house, see what you have, and use those. Or if you want a better option and if you're willing to spend a little bit of money, you can get phone holders. So here's a few examples from Kmart. You can get this little tripod handle thing for $15. You can get this little GorillaPod kind of flexi tripod for $8. And you can wrap this around like a pole or something. These are pretty handy. Things like that. Or even some car dash phone holders that you can kind of stick to something and just maneuver where you want the camera to be pointing. Now I'll end the video here, but next video we'll be talking about camera settings and apps and softwares that you might be using to capture your stop motion.